I'm Andrew Amman. I'm the director of the Harold Schnitzer Diabetes Center, and we're all here today for the Darlene Kane Care and Cure Diabetes Lecture. For those of you who have not previously attended the Darlene Kane Lecture, please recognize that it honors a truly special individual who gave so much of herself to others. She and her husband Jim raised 3 wonderful children, all of whom actually pursued an active career in medicine. Jim himself was an OHSU graduate from the dental school. After she raised her kids, she turned to multiple volunteer activities with energy, commitment, and purpose. Diabetes advocacy became one of her primary causes. She volunteered with the American Diabetes Association, both locally and nationally. She served as the vice chair of the American Diabetes Association Research Foundation and later rose to be the national chair of the board of the American Diabetes Association. Not long after that, we were really fortunate to have her join us as the chair of our Harold Schnitzer Diabetes Health Center advisory boards in the early years of our center. We are grateful that after her unfortunate death, her husband Jim and her children chose to fund the Darlene Kane Lectureship, where we present diverse national perspectives on the problem of diabetes. Her family plans to honor her with a named professorship soon, but we'll continue to have this annual lecture in her name in the month of November, which is Diabetes Month. This represents the 5th annual Darlene Kane Lecture. As many of you know, as many of you would recognize and appreciate, the OHSU Department of Medicine Grand Rounds has featured multiple topics addressing social justice and health disparities this year. We know that Darlene would have been championing this cause if she were alive. Therefore, we're very pleased to have Dr. Monica Peak present our 2020 lecture. Dr. Peak received her MD and M.P.H degrees at Johns Hopkins. She completed her internal medicine residency at Stanford. She is presently associate professor of medicine at the University of Chicago, where she provides clinical care, teaches, and conducts health services research in the area of health disparities. Dr. Peak is the associate director of Chicago Center for Diabetes Translation Research, where she heads the Health Disparities and Community-Based Participatory Research Corps. She is also director of research at the MacLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics and the executive medical director of the Community Health Innovation at the University of Chicago. She is co-director of a national program for Bridging the Gap aimed at reducing disparities in diabetes care, and there's one site, if I am correct, in Portland. She has authored numerous publications, presented multiple lectures at ADA scientific sessions and other major national meetings, and has garnered multiple awards. So as soon as we're ready, we'd like to welcome Dr. Peak as she presents her lecture on structural inequities in diabetes, challenges and solutions. There's Jennifer from Europe, if we can hear you.
My brother just nominated me to speak. He said,
We're both
thanks,
here.
Jeff. Throw your little sister under the bus. So, Monica, we're so thrilled that you are here to give this lecture, and we can't wait to hear it. And I think for everyone on the call, we're so grateful for your commitment to diabetes care and commitment to the future and advocacy of diabetes care in your communities. Darlene was an extremely passionate person who loved everything about the cure care commitment of diabetes, and she could, in a room of 1,000 people, get people to pull out a check to cut the check for diabetes research. She was incredibly effective in mobilizing volunteers towards this cause that you all share. So grateful that you are here to celebrate this and to continue to bring this legacy of cure care and commitment from Darlene. Thank you, everybody.
Jennifer, do you have a connection to Dr. Peak in your background?
Do I have a connection? Excuse me?
She got her master's of public health from Johns Hopkins. Did you go there?
I did. I went to Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and I was also part of the World Health Organization and the World Bank. I was in the World Health Organization when she created the UN resolution that actually founded World Diabetes Day. So I think that one thing that Darlene shows us is that it doesn't matter where you come from. You can do anything if your mind and your heart is in the right place. And she lived that ethos in the world of diabetes fundraising and in research and in advocacy. So I think that's really the story that she would be saying. And of course, she would probably all give you a big lipstick kiss and a hug. Right, Andy?
Yes.
I think I'm going to throw my big brother under the bus now. Jeff, you need to get up here.
Sure. I'm Jeff Kane. I'm in Denver. I'm a family doctor and also attended to OHSU. And Mom was really passionate about diabetes and the care that she was doing with Andy, and was really interested in helping work with efforts to be able to cure diabetes or prevent diabetes. And so outreach into communities of needs, like communities that are disadvantaged, would fit directly with her philosophy. She would always say, you make a life by what you get, living by what you get, you make a life by what you give. And I think giving back in this way fits with her life course. She would also say, if you want to get something done, ask a busy person. So that's one of the reasons why she really liked working with Andy, because he's been busy and successful. And so I think that the family is honored that we can help participate and give back and give on. Again, one of her states, it's not what you give now, it's but what carries on beyond your words. And so we're hoping that this effort with the professorship and with the lectureship can help carry on that legacy and can make a real difference in diabetes and the ongoing care. Thank you, Andy.
Okay, thanks, guys. Okay, Monica, do you want to go ahead?
Absolutely. So thank you again for having me. It's a delight to be here to talk about structural inequities in diabetes, challenges and solutions. I'd like to first start by just acknowledging the several places at the university where I sit, including the Chicago Center for Diabetes Translation Research, the University of Chicago Medicine's Bucksbaum Institute for Clinical Excellence, the MacLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics, and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, among others. So today we're going to talk about a number of things, but I wanted to just make sure that we level set with some of the terminology. We're going to talk about health disparities, social determinants of health, structural inequities, the built-in social environment, and how all of these things impact diabetes and the importance of integrating social needs into medical care in order to ultimately improve the health of our most vulnerable populations and reduce disparities. So I'm going to start by just showing a map from 2004 about how there is geographic variation and how the prevalence of both obesity and diabetes have increased over time within the United States. So this again is a map of 2004. This is a map of 2010. And this is a map from 2016. So it shows that we've had a market increase just in that short period of time, but yet and still there's a lot of geographic variation with higher prevalence rates in the southern parts of the country. And even within any given state, there's a significant variation within the state. And if you shrink that down, there'll be geographic variation within communities. So I'm hailing from Chicago. And so oh no, let's see my next slide. Here to be stuck. There we go. Chicago is a wonderful city, but it's one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States. And so this is a map showing racial clustering. And so if there's a group that has more than 90% of its residents that are one racial or ethnic group, then that gets a color. If there is no majority, then that community area is colored white. And so you'll see that for most of the city, the areas, the communities are clustered with more than 90% of its residents. And so the green areas are neighborhoods that are more than 90% African American. The orange areas are neighborhoods that are more than 90% Latino. The purple areas are neighborhoods that are more than 90% white. And then the white areas are areas that have some element of racial heterogeneity, with area 41 sort of right in the middle of the green being Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is located. And so if you look at indices of diabetes mortality and morbidity, we see that within the southern and western parts of the city, where there are more African Americans and Latinos, we see excess rates of diabetes mortality. We see higher rates of potential years of life lost in the city due to diabetes. And we see more avoidable diabetes-related hospitalizations. And so, again, thinking about that geographic variation of diabetes and obesity that I was first showing, we could also see that some of that geographic variation is linked to the racial and ethnic composition of areas. And so there's those two things are intertwined for many parts of the country. We know that urban areas tend to have higher proportions of minorities, whereas rural areas tend to have higher proportions of non-minorities. And so when we talk about the built environment and geographic distribution, we also have to be thinking about how the resources in those environments interplay with the racial composition of who is living in those communities and areas. Okay. Just to level set on the term of health disparities, when we use that term, it's important to know that we use that nomenclature to talk about two different kinds of disparities, either disparities in the kind of health care that's provided to patients when they're in our healthcare system, or disparities in health outcomes, the health status that ultimately results. And these two things are obviously related in that the kind of care that we deliver to patients obviously impacts the health that results. However, only a small portion, about 15 to 20% of the medical care that people receive has impact on the overall health. So if we want to make sure that people are healthy, we have to think not only about changing the healthcare system, but we also have to think about changes outside of the healthcare system, where the largest proportion of determinants of health are impacting the health of our population. And so we typically think about those kinds of things or term those things the social determinants of health or the non-medical determinants of health. And there's a growing literature that shows the relationship between these social determinants of health and health outcomes. So particularly if we're thinking about diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, those things that tend to run together, we find that things like residential segregation, community violence, food insecurity, limitations in the built environment, racial discrimination, including racial discrimination within healthcare, all of those have been associated with these outcomes that we're interested in or concerned about when we think about diabetes disparities. And I'm going to talk about each one of these social determinants of health today. And it's important to know that when we talk about social determinants of health or structural inequities, social structural determinants of health, what we mean is that these are policies and procedures that dictate differential access to goods and services, and that these inequities are based on social identity. So social determinants of health are really things that determines people's health based on policies that determines different people's differential access to goods and services based on your social identity. And so everyone has multiple social identities, and depending on which identity you have, that social identity is associated with more or less social power. So if we think about race and ethnicity, gender and gender identity, sexual orientation, ability or disability, someone is going to have more power, someone's going to have less power, depending on which identity they have. And so within this country, ethnic minorities have less power, men have more power, heterosexuals have more power, the abled have more power. And that is typically the case in many countries. And so structural equity and inequity are cut along the lines of which social identities have more power. And so you'll find that marginalized social groups tend to accrue more and more health inequities because of the mechanisms by which poor health occurs. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It's also important to know that when we talk about healthcare equity, that equitable care does not mean the same care. If you give everyone the same amount of care, what you'll be doing is perpetuating disparities in outcomes. That in order to find equal outcomes, we're going to have to give those who are disadvantaged more. And so when we think about high-risk populations, we're already used to thinking about that in healthcare when we talk about high-risk groups and targeting them for additional resources. It's the same thing, but we just apply certain kinds of labels to high-risk groups and thinking about who those high-risk groups are. And so if we really want to see equitable care with optimal outcomes, it just means that we have to think about which populations are suffering disproportionately and target those populations for additional services and resources. So let's take an example of food insecurity, because that's one that we think about a lot for diabetes. And we know that food insecurity has been associated with poor diabetes control. So there was a study using NHANES data that included both type 1 and type 2 diabetes patients. And they found that there was an odds ratio or an increased odds of about 1.5 of having poor diabetes control, defined as an A1C of greater than 9, even after adjusting for sociodemographic factors, BMI, and diabetes medications for patients who were food insecure. And then there's a separate study that drilled down onto people who were most likely to be food insecure. So those who were already low income, those who were living with type 2 diabetes and were living in an urban area. And so amongst those people who were food insecure, the odds ratio of having poor diabetes control was more than 2, was 2.23. However, if those very same patients were actually on SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, what we used to think about are called food stamps, those people had a decreased odds of having food security. They had an odds ratio of 0.35. And so here we see a social determinant of health, food insecurity, that can be associated with worse diabetes control. But if you address that social need or that social determinant, then it can be associated with improved diabetes control or decreased risk of having poor control. And so these are factors or variables that are mutable. They're not things that cannot be fixed by our healthcare system and by our society at large. And so that's the good news to the story of these health inequities that we see in our society that come into our clinical office and manifest as patients with worse disease. Okay. Having sometimes poor challenges. Okay. So if we think now about the built and the social environment and what that means as far as affecting health outcomes, this is the sort of beginning of a conceptual model. I'm going to come back and refer to that multiple times. The natural environment, by that I mean sort of the air, water, earth, the things that naturally occur, feeds into the built environment. The macro social environment will define that. And then obviously inequities. All of those sort of feed into the social and built environment, which ultimately can impact health outcomes. I'm going to take a minute and just define what the built and social environment are. So the built environment are physical spaces or structures that are created by people for day-to-day use, so different than the naturally occurring environment. Examples for things in the built environment that might be health promoting would be things like grocery stores, pharmacies, other kinds of health facilities, recreation facilities, green spaces that have parks associated with them, churches, for example, where people can go for faith healing, but also may have additional services in them, like AA programs or childcare services or things that are there where people can get other health promoting programs and services. The social environment is the immediate social setting in which people live, and it includes people, culture, and networks. So it can include things that can be negative, like violent crime, theft, safety, discrimination. We'll talk more about that, and unfair treatment. But it can also be things that are positive and that can buffer negative effects and help promote health. Things like social networks and social capital, social cohesion. All right, so now we're going to add an additional layer onto the conceptual model and understand that we have to actually utilize things that are in the built environment, and understand that it is the psychological and physiological distress that can result from things in the social environment, or our ability to manage that distress, and to cope with that can lead to how we engage in health behaviors and how those things can ultimately impact our diabetes health outcomes and other chronic disease health outcomes. This is that same model sort of expanded more in a more complex and sophisticated way. I only show you this because we are going to dive a little more deeply into things like residential segregation, and social cohesion, and very specific things that I wanted to be able to have a backdrop for discussing. So we're going to take, for example, residential segregation. And so we know that that has been associated with diabetes and obesity. So there was a study about 10 years ago in the American Journal of Epidemiology that found that residential segregation was associated with obesity and type 2 diabetes, even after adjusting for personal and family factors. The picture that I have on the screen is actually a picture of Milwaukee and residential redlining that realtors used to use when determining where Black families could and could not be offered housing to, and how the term redlining came to be with actual red markers. And so there's a study that came out around the same time in 2011 in Health Affairs that actually found within Baltimore, for a community that was residentially integrated, they found a comparable prevalence of diabetes between Blacks and whites. And in these communities, they found that the effects of diabetes prevalence was driven more so by comparable rates of neighborhood deprivation, which are markers of things like economic disadvantage, unemployment, education, housing, more so than racial concordance. And so that means that the built environment has a large impact on people's health. And so these are cross-sectional studies. And so the question is, do we have any data to show that where and how people live affects long-term the onset or the development of things like obesity and diabetes? And so there was a study that came out in the New England Journal that was looking at people who are living in public housing. And it was a social experiment where the primary outcomes had nothing to do with health, but as a secondary aim, they were measuring things like weight, hemoglobin A1C, BMI, and what they were doing was taking people that, as the city's public housing in Chicago was slowly being torn down, they gave people vouchers, and they had the opportunity to have sort of a standard voucher and move to another neighborhood of equal value, so another low income neighborhood, or they had an opportunity, they had a voucher to move to an opportunity, a neighborhood with less poverty, so a higher value voucher, so a moving to an opportunity. Or they could just, do business as usual and move to wherever they thought they could afford. And those individuals that moved to opportunity, that moved to more economic opportunity, moved to places where there were more resources, where there were more grocery stores, healthier areas, more parks, less poverty, less crime. And over a 2-year period, a little less than 2 years, there were significant differences in the onset of class 2 and 3 obesity, and in the onset of diabetes between that group and the 2 other groups. And so we see that those people with their same biology, sociocultural norms, their same family environments, everything intact, just physically relocating to different neighborhoods, had differential onset of obesity and diabetes because of the environments in which they moved to. And so this is some of the first evidence that we see of how the physical environment can impact the onset of things like diabetes and obesity. So getting back to this model, we'll now tack towards something like social cohesion and collective efficacy. And so social cohesion is defined as the degree of connectedness and solidarity among people living in a geographic area. And collective efficacy is just social cohesion with the added expectation of social control. The idea that we're a group and we have the power as a group to affect change in our community. And those two things have been associated with how well diabetes is controlled amongst people in those communities. So type 2, so for example, low collective self-efficacy has been associated with type 2 diabetes, with the possible mediator believed to be physical activity and poor nutrition. And then high collective efficacy was found to be associated with lower rates of type 2 diabetes, thinking that the high collective efficacy may buffer some of the macrosocial factors around racism, and that increased community and trust, increased community trust and safety may promote healthy behaviors. So, for example, when people are able to come together and feel safe within their neighborhood, they may be more likely to engage and form walking groups. They may be more likely to advocate and get a big box grocery store, a Walgreens or a Target to come into their community. And especially for marginalized low-income communities where there are already fewer resources, advocating for businesses to come into communities is something that frequently happens as a result of community mobilization and action. And so having collective efficacy is particularly important for low-income communities of color. And so we can see how that can directly tie into or be a mechanism on the causal mechanism of action between collective efficacy and outcomes like chronic diseases such as obesity and type 2 diabetes. So we're going to talk a little bit about discrimination because it is a huge underlying factor for so many health disparities, and because it's had such a national stage in the year 2020. And so let's just get to it. So we can think about how are the many ways that discrimination may affect people's health. And there are multiple mechanisms. And so the primary way in which we normally think about this as a chronic stressor. So the multiple chronic the stressors, the day-to-day acts of discrimination, rather than sort of the large major events, but the micro events that happen on a daily basis for persons who are experiencing discrimination. And so there are pathophysiological changes that happen when someone is chronically stressed. So there's autonomic dysregulation, immune dysregulation, endocrine dysfunction like the stress hormone cortisol. We can see how that directly leads to or is part of diabetes, inflammatory dysregulation. All of these things increase the risks for chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. There are epigenetic mechanisms where the protective factors of our telomeres, those are shortened as a result of life stressors, such as poverty. And then obviously the one that we most clearly think about are the structural inequities, just the decreased access to goods and services, those goods and services that are needed to live a healthy life that can prolong your lifespan and that can decrease your morbidity. And then there are other mechanisms that we're learning about, like social isolation, and I'll talk a bit about that. So these are just some headlines of papers that go into detail about some of the mechanisms of action. So this one is called the accelerated telomere shortening in response to life stress. This one says the chronic exposure to everyday discrimination and coronary artery calcification in African American women, the Swan Heart Study. Self-reported experiences of everyday discrimination are associated with elevated C-reactive protein levels in older African American adults. Epigenetic signals of how social disadvantage gets under the skin, a challenge to the public health community. So again, thinking about the two types of disparities, we recognize that there are disparities in healthcare. And the National Academy of Medicine, when it was still called the Institute of Medicine, came out with this conceptual model that recognized that in addition to structural inequities, that there are also interpersonal biases, discrimination that contributed to the disparities in healthcare delivery that happened within healthcare. And so going back to how discrimination affects healthcare, how discrimination affects health, we see that healthcare delivery is one of those goods and services that minorities can have decreased access to or differential access to as a mechanism of impacting their health. And so this is a study that actually I did a while ago, looking at self-reported racial discrimination in healthcare and diabetes outcomes. And we looked at a number of different measures of diabetes quality for a number of different measures for diabetes quality of care, 2 different measures for diabetes outcomes, and then several measures for diabetes self-care. And what we found is that for 3 of the 4 measures of diabetes quality of care, that is primary care visits, testing for hemoglobin A1C, and eye examinations on time with a regular interval, that people who reported healthcare discrimination had an odds that was less than half compared to those who did not report racial discrimination in healthcare, so ranging between 0.38 and 0.58. And then for those who reported discrimination in healthcare, they had more than twice the odds of having complications from diabetes. Diabetes-related foot disorders and diabetes-related retinopathy. And we know that there are significant disparities in diabetes-related limb amputations and diabetes-related blindness. And so these are precursors to both of those things, that there are significant associations with reports of healthcare discrimination. These same people, however, had no differences in how they cared for themselves. And so when we were using data from the BRFIS data set from the CDC. And so when we asked, or when these people were asked about, were they checking their own sugars? Were they checking their own feet? Had they gone to diabetes education classes? There are no differences in how these people were caring for themselves. But when it came to how they felt they were being cared for by the healthcare system and ultimately their health outcomes, there are significant differences for those who reported racial discrimination in healthcare and those who did not. I'm going to talk a bit now about community violence, because that too has taken a large bit of our emotional and cognitive space in the year 2020. And so this is a paper that looked at community violence and social isolation. What we now know is that social isolation is a risk factor that can be likened to something like cigarette smoking as far as its impact on cardiovascular outcomes. And actually, even in the United Kingdom, they have a minister of loneliness because of the recognition of the public health impact of social isolation and loneliness on their population. And so what we did was looked at the impact of community violence on patients who are mostly middle-aged women living in 2 epicenters of violence in Chicago, the South Side and the West Side. And we're looking at a number of factors like social isolation. And what we found is that people who had higher rates of exposure to community violence were much more likely to report being socially isolated. And that those who were more socially isolated had a lower intake of fresh fruits and vegetables, had less adherence to their medication regimen, and were more likely to use negative coping mechanisms like to binge on alcohol or to use tobacco, all things that are not good for management of diabetes. We also, within the same study population, so same group of people, same survey, with people who were exposed to community violence, also asked about not only community violence, but police violence. And we looked in addition to looking at social isolation, looked at hypervigilance and the impact of what chronically being hypervigilant means for your health. And what we found is that a number of things that were startling, just as far as the descriptive statistics. So nearly 60% of the people in our study reported exposure, either direct or indirect exposure to community violence. That's nearly 60%. I personally have never been exposed to community violence. And my guess is that many people who are watching this have not either in their lifetime. So imagine 60% of people in our clinic population have been exposed, in our sample, which is representative of our clinic, have been exposed to community violence. Nearly a third of those reported any exposure to police violence, nearly 30%. And about 10% had involved a police stop that they described as being traumatic, traumatic enough to qualify as being hitting marks for PTSD. And what we found was that for each of these, there were increased rates of hypervigilance, so that the most hypervigilant that people were for a traumatic police stop. And so the difference compared to the reference group was an increase of 20 points, as opposed to being exposed to police violence, which was about 10 points, as compared to community violence, which was about 5 points. And the most important thing is that for the highest levels of hypervigilance, that was associated with an increased systolic blood pressure of about 8.6 points. And we know from the Framingham Heart Study that that's an increase in blood pressure that's associated with about a 50% increase in heart attack or stroke. And so what that means is that for the communities that are coming into the clinic where I see patients on the south side of Chicago, that just living in their home, the stress of doing so puts them at increased risk of having a heart attack or stroke by 50%. Unrelated to obesity, diabetes, my ability to control them with the medications that I'm giving, just living in a neighborhood that's full of violence and being traumatized by over-policing has increased their risk of having a heart attack or stroke by 50%. And so that really means that we have to begin thinking about how we are addressing these structural inequities that impact disproportionately our marginalized patients if we are really going to try and get at the heart of health disparities. And so that really means that it begs the question of how we're going to do that. How are we going to begin addressing not only the medical, but the social needs of our most marginalized and vulnerable patients within the healthcare systems, and by working in partnership with social service agencies and community-based organizations? This really holds promise for not only reducing healthcare costs, but reducing healthcare utilization, improving healthcare outcomes, improving patient satisfaction, and reducing disparities in care and outcomes. So again, I'll just refer us back to this model and walk us through just an example of some of the kind of work that I've been doing with my co-director, Dr. Marshall Chen, on the south side of Chicago for what we call the Southside Diabetes Project. We've been doing this for about a decade now. I'm going to talk about two different kinds of projects that we've been doing. So the first is the Southside Diabetes Project, where if we take diabetes as our example, since we're talking about diabetes disparities, and so we think we're about the built environment and the social environment. And what we're doing is thinking not only about all of the negatives, the stressors, the things that are missing and that can contribute to poor health, but we're trying to leverage the positives and the strengths and build on those to improve people's health, to be health promoting, and to partner with community-based organizations. So we are working with park districts and farmers markets and community organizations and grocery stores. We are working to address issues of racism and increase coping through classes and public health campaign around being healthy in the African American community. All these things to try and promote a sense of diabetes wellness and promote diabetes self-care within the community, in addition to what we're doing within the health systems to try and improve diabetes outcomes on the South Side. So our model has quality improvement, provider training, patient activation, as well as community partnerships. And right now I'm just going to lean into the community partnerships portion. And this is just a partial listing of the organizations that we have and continue to work with. And so one of those is a food pantry that is set up in Washington Park. And Washington Park is a huge park that is right across from the University of Chicago, where there's about an 8-year life expectancy difference between Hyde Park and Washington Park, which are just less than a mile away from each other. And so we're working with a community violence center whose goal is to reduce violence amongst young men and within the community. But once a month, they collaborate with the Chicago Food Depository to distribute healthy food. And we work with them to do a lot of nutrition education. These are just some of our patients who've been through our diabetes classes that are participating at the food pantry. So we have worked in collaboration with Kennedy King College with their nursing program and with their culinary program, so that we have chefs come and prepare samples of the food that are being given out that day, so we can have recipes on what healthy food would taste like, and how to prepare the foods that are being prepared, they're being distributed. We have various talks on diabetes and diabetes related things for people while they're waiting for food to be distributed. We work with, again, the grocery stores that are in the neighborhood, low cost grocery stores where people are doing their shopping, like Save-A-Lot. And so this is a picture of one of our dietitians who we have free tours every Saturday. We've been doing this for a decade and collecting data on this. And so she teaches people how to shop on a budget. And at the end of the tour, they get a gift card from Save-A-Lot where they can then go shop. And what we found is that people are purchasing a higher percentage of fresh fruits and vegetables than people do on a national average. And so we find that giving people information and tools and resources can help the most marginalized do better about changing their shopping patterns, their eating patterns, in a way that can promote management of their chronic diseases despite limitations to their built environment. We have worked in partnership with the Chicago Park District, with farmers markets, and with Walgreens, where Walgreens has located themselves in many areas of food, in many communities where there's otherwise a food desert and not a grocery store. And they have designated what they call themselves food desert Walgreens stores, where they are bringing in fresh produce every morning because they may be the only place in that neighborhood that is providing fresh fruits and vegetables. So for those food desert Walgreens that are in the catchment area of our participating clinics, we have prescriptions for free food that we are giving out to patients that are at our participating clinics, so they can have more access and incentives for healthy eating, again, utilizing things that are within their built environment. These are pictures from the farmers market. And at that farmers market, these are, again, some patients that have graduated from our diabetes class. We utilize the idea of social capital. And so, again, this is one of our diabetes educators. You saw her in a previous picture at the Save-A-Lot tour. And we have a gentleman who's holding a clipboard. He graduated from one of our diabetes classes. And so you hear me mention a lot about these diabetes classes. What we're doing is not only training people to take care of themselves, but training people to take care of their community. And so they are out and about at many of our community-facing programs, helping to introduce other people in the community for ways to be healthy, to do warm handoffs for various programs that are part of their neighborhood resources that they may otherwise not know about. When people typically think about a farmer's market, people are not usually thinking about low-income African Americans, including low-income African Americans. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we have people who look like them from the community that are introducing them to farmers, that are showing them how to cook with the foods that are there. There are, doing a warm handoff. Our team is there. That's our table tent. That day, one of our local representatives had stopped by. We're doing surveys. And so we're doing our research. We're doing it in a way that's community engaged, and that feels like we're a part of the process. And so we're using our social capital. We're part of the social environment, as well as leveraging the built environment within our community. And so then I'll lean a little bit into just this patient activation that I was mentioning, these diabetes classes. And so they are ones that talk about culturally tailored diabetes education, but also really want to empower patients through shared decision making. And their classes were, we talk specifically about structural inequities and race, and how patients can better understand the healthcare system, better understand their rights, and how to form better partnerships with providers, and to maximize the time and the space and the space of the patient-provider relationship, to be their best self, and to be the best patient they can be, in order to take the most care that they can of their health and their family. And we found high retention rates, and a drop in A1C that's been equivalent to what it would be like to take a medication. And again, these patients have then become advocates within the community. And we have done this, we've been so successful because we have tailored these classes to patients' lived experiences. We spent a lot of work doing, a lot of time and effort doing qualitative work and modifying these classes iteratively based on people's lived experiences. And so we have found what we think is an effective way of providing an engaging classroom for people who live on the south side of Chicago to learn about themselves and their neighbors and celebrate who they are, and feel excited about going back out into the community and helping others. And we found improvements not only in diabetes outcomes, but in shared decision-making outcomes, and other kinds of health outcomes as well. And again, these are just some pictures from our patients, and this is a billboard. We have a diabetes cook-off every year around the holidays. And this is a billboard on the south side of the winners from one year. I'm going to talk a little bit now about something called Bridging the Gap. And that is a current initiative that Dr. Chen and I are currently co-directing, and that is specifically working, we're the National Program Office for that, to have organizations that are medical, that deliver medical care, and specifically work with non-medical organizations to improve the health. So integrating social needs and medical needs specifically. So that was a lot of what we did, or what we're doing with the Southside Diabetes Project. But now, as the National Program Office, that's the message that we're proselytizing to other sites. So we have 8 demonstration sites across the country. And there's a lot of heterogeneity, not only in geographic location, but in patient population, in payer mix, in lots of different ways. And our goal is to sort of make sure that we're building sustainable partnerships, that the health systems are redesigning redesigning themselves in ways to improve diabetes care for vulnerable and underserved populations, specifically to be able to meet the needs of their social risk profiles for patients who have type 2 diabetes, but mainly because type 2 diabetes is just, a poster child for chronic diseases for which that are sensitive to the built-in social environment. And so that gets us to this idea of social needs screening and referral. And that's where we are right now as a country and health systems. Is how are we able to do that? What are the best tools that we have? Where's the infrastructure for that? And we're still figuring this out. And so we've come a long way in the past few years, but this is kind of where the state of the science is. And so there are a number of tools that are out there. Many of our sites are using Prepare. CMS has an official tool that they're using for trying to identify social needs for patients, but there is no official standard screening process. Epic has come up with, for many of you who are using Epic, has come up with its own list of screening questions that you can probably activate for a fee, of course, within your EMR. And there's the infrastructure now to be able to do this in a way that we didn't have a decade ago. Many of us didn't have 5 years ago. Nowpal is a software platform that will integrate with your EMR. Many of the platforms may not integrate, but are at least standalone systems that are better than the posted notes or binders that our social workers have carried around, or the mental notes that people have had in their head, or word of mouth. And so what we need are systems in place. We need standardized, validated questions. We need the infrastructure and platforms to be able to talk to our electronic medical records, and we need boots on the ground. We need the human capital. One of our sites in Oakland is, and I have a picture of them, they have more behavioral health workers, social workers, et cetera, than they have physicians. Their ratio is something like 2 to 1. I think we may have one social worker in my clinic, and we are thankful to have her. But in order for us to really think about addressing the very complex needs of our patients, we are going to have to reimagine what it means to have a healthcare team, and who is part of that team, and what we need to be able to mobilize that team, where they can go, the technology that they're going to need. And so we're just now starting to scratch the top of that surface to get there. But I am super excited because we are at least trying. we're starting to get there. And so some of the questions, the important questions that we're asking just are, what are some of the opportunities that we have to improve on how we address social needs, and how has screening allowed our organizations to work at the individual and systemic levels to address the social and medical needs of high-risk, complex populations. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures. This is one of our sites, La Clínica del Pueblo. It's in Washington, D.C. The vast majority of their patients are immigrants from El Salvador, and their primary social determinant of health that they're addressing is immigration, and all of the things that come with that. And so they are working with their primary non-medical partner is a nonprofit legal organization, an advocacy group that helps their clients navigate all of the legal needs that they need, be they documented or undocumented immigrants, in order to feel safe and to have all of the things in play so they can then begin to prioritize their diabetes. All of our sites are certainly working with food distribution sites and food pantries. Some of them have on-site food banks and ways for people to get food while they're at clinic seeing their physician. But they're also thinking about other social determinants of health that are very specific to their population. This is the site in Oakland that is focusing on returning citizens, meaning people that are coming home from being incarcerated. And so their primary social determinant of health is employment and how to make sure that these Black men have a job. It is very hard to get a job if you have a felony record. And so on site, this picture is on site of their within their health system. They have a room that has several rooms that have been dedicated to light manufacturing and training men to do things like make soap and do other kinds of things. And so this is sort of the packaging element of it. So you see these baskets that are being made, and they sell them in the gift shop area, which is also the front desk check-in. These are the nicest guys. They're so sweet and kind. And I have like soap in my bathroom that is delightful. And so they are, you know, again, you see a sign here that says Roots Community Market. They have on-site fresh fruit. They have their street outreach van where they are going out and doing direct service outreach for homeless persons, but they are also prioritizing employment as a social determinant of health. This is a team that we have in New Jersey, the Trenton Health Team, and they have built a fabulous, clearly state-of-the-art kitchen, which is functioning like their local Starbucks as far as being a place for not only a built, but also a social environment. So people come there for their diabetes classes, but they're also coming there for social support and to hang out and to have fellowship with other people who understand the trials and tribulations of their lived experience. And then they volunteer and they help others. And so it's a wonderful space. So if you think about all the reasons why people may leave their home and go to Starbucks, that's what people are doing in this kind of space. It's not just a physical space. And so these sites are thinking about their healthcare systems in radically new and different ways. And that's what it's going to take for us to reimagine healthcare in order for us to get to the root of some of the causes of health disparities and for us to really see and envision healthy communities. I can see it, and I get really excited when I know that it's almost here. So with that, I would like to just give a shout out to the National Program Office of Bridging the Gap, including my co-director, Marshall Chen, and again, just acknowledging the various places that I sit on campus. And I'd like to thank you for your time and for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful lecture series today. Thank you very much.